we see that spiritual abuse part come in along with whatever other form of abuse is going on. We've now mucked it up even more because now it's maybe being done in the name of God. And like, now what do we do with that? And that's where we end up seeing people here, coming to us where they're like, this was done in the name of Jesus. Who is this Jesus really?
This is from a sociologist named Brad Wilcox. He's at the University of Virginia, and he's considered one of the top marriage researchers in the country. And to give you a sense of his status, he writes in places like the New York Times. So this is a quote from the New York Times. He says, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives." By the way, they focus on the wives, of course, because the assumption is that if you believe in any form of male headship, that will turn men into overbearing, tyrannical patriarchs. But the happiest wives in all America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he goes on to say, this is actually my favorite part. He turns to his fellow sociologists, who of course are mostly secular. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So the bottom line is that Christians actually do have a very practical answer to reconciling the sexes, as I put it in the subtitle of my book. And it's not just a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid, empirically based research. We have evidence-based findings that we should be really proclaiming both in the church to encourage Christian men and in the public square to help counter the negative media stereotypes.
It is encouraging. And I can see where, depending on the circle someone runs in, it's not information they'd want to hear. And my pushback on that would be, it's good news no matter what, that we have women who are not being abused. So, I mean, let's champion that wherever that's happening. Yes, that's a good thing.
Yes. And I mean, the important thing is that we also look at the other side of the research, which was that the negative stereotypes of evangelical men arise because there are nominal Christian men who test out quite differently. So the good news is about men who actually attend church regularly and live it out. But when people started saying, but wait a minute, don't Christians divorce at the same rate as everyone else? The researchers went back to the data and they made a distinction between those who are active churchgoers and those who are merely nominal. My students don't even know what nominal means. So I have to explain NOM is Latin for name. So it means in name only. So these are men who on a survey like this might check the Baptist box, for example, but who actually don't attend church at all, rarely, if at all, and who identify as evangelicals because of their family background, their culture, and so on. And these men test out dramatically differently. In fact, they test out, their wives test out as the unhappiest with their husband's treatment of them. They spend the least amount of time with their children. Nominal Christian men divorce at a higher rate even than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men. So this is the shocker, is that, under the umbrella of evangelical, the reason you get the statistics get skewed is because you have men who are testing out better than secular men, but men who are also testing out as worse than secular men. And so I think the challenge for the church, at least, is how do we support the men, encourage the men who are doing well, because they feel beaten down just as much as other men do. When I told my class at Houston Christian University that I'm writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So even in Christian circles, men do feel like there's a certain hostility to masculinity. But then how does the church also reach out more effectively to these men who claim an evangelical identity, but who are taking biblical words like headship and submission And they're not Christian enough to know what the biblical meaning of those terms is. And so they're infusing those terms with meaning from the secular world, dominance, control, entitlement, and so on. And ironically, some people have said, well, why are they even worse than secular men? Apparently it's because they're taking the secular script for masculinity, but they're putting religious language on it. And so they feel religious justification. The secular person at least doesn't feel he has religious justification for abusing his family. But the religious man feels like he has religious justification. And so they end up with the worst of both worlds. They end up worse than secular men. So this is a challenge. How does the church reach out and disciple these men better? The two sides of it. How can the church reach out to the men who are doing well? And how does the church reach out to disciple the men who are claiming an evangelical identity, but doing worse than secular men?
Oh, Nancy, you just summarized that so well. So yes, what you just spoke to of what can happen in homes when someone is a nominal Christian, like you said, where they're not really living according to biblical truth. They're just slapping terms on things and maybe wrongly kind of identifying as something that they're not really living out. That's where we then see that, speaking to our audience here at beEmboldened, we see that spiritual abuse part come in along with whatever other form of abuse is going on. If it is domestic violence or if it is sexual abuse, something else going on within the household. We've now mucked it up even more because now it's maybe being done in the name of God. And like, now what do we do with that? And so then worldview gets really messy. Someone's potential relationship with Jesus can go out the window. And that's where we end up seeing people here, coming to us where they're like, this was done in the name of Jesus. Who is this Jesus really? Yeah, it's just, it blows it way up even more. And it's so bad to begin with, but it adds this extra layer that's so confusing.
Oh, well, as you know, you've read the book. I start with the story of growing up in an abusive home, which is one reason I appreciate your ministry so much. My father was severely physically abusive. Books on abuse will sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? It was closed fist. He was punching us. Actually, his favorite was the knuckle fist. So it would produce a sharper stab of pain. And he was quite open about it. He would say, do this or I'll beat you. I mean, he was very open that he was beating us. And so, yes, of course, I left my faith in high school. It was a Lutheran upbringing. So I don't know if you know this, but Scandinavians are Lutheran in the way that all Italians are Catholic. So my parents were Scandinavian and they were Lutheran, but it was more of an ethnic background rather than true commitment. And so when I was in high school, I started asking questions about my religious upbringing, and I eventually walked away entirely, and became very enamored of feminist books, read feminist books for a decade. But you're right. When I finally started rethinking Christianity, which, by the way, happened at L'Abri. L'Abri is, you may know, L'Abri is the ministry of Francis Schaeffer, and he was well known for having an apologetics ministry. And it was in Switzerland. We used to live in Europe when I was a child. And so I'd gone back to Europe and I sort of stumbled across this ministry in Switzerland. And by that time I had absorbed all kinds of secular worldviews. And so I was stunned by this place because I'd never met any Christians who could talk about the secular worldviews that I had absorbed by that time, who could answer those worldviews, who could show that Christianity had answers to them. So that was really the reason I became a Christian, returned to my Christian faith. But also on staff at L'Abri was a psychiatric social worker. And she was there because she knew that for many people, the barriers to Christianity are not just intellectual, but are emotional, especially if you've had an abusive background. If you've had parents who said this is what Christianity is, and then they beat you, I mean, you can see why that would be a barrier. And once I worked through some of the intellectual questions, I began to realize, I actually do have a strong emotional barrier, because whatever my parents are, I do not want to be. I do not want to be anything like my parents. And so I had to work through that emotional barrier as well. I didn't want to have the Christianity that my parents had. Fortunately, L'Abri, Francis Schaeffer's ministry, showed me a different kind of Christianity that was intellectually viable, that was emotionally loving. It was a kind of Christian community Many people said they became Christians there because they experienced a quality of love that they had never experienced back home in their family or their Christian churches. And I would say that was a big part of my reason for becoming a Christian too, because not only did I become intellectually convinced it was true, but I could see emotionally that actually this works in the real world. These people are actually very loving. And then the psychiatric social worker, her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie. And then Birdie was helping me to work through the trauma of my childhood, because when I left home, I wanted to push it all. I wanted to totally erase my whole childhood. I thought I could do this, right? I could start over with a blank slate and build my whole self anew. And Birdie helped me to see, actually, you can't do that. You have to work through the trauma of your childhood. And so this was wonderful, because right from the start of my Christian faith, I had both a very rich intellectual understanding, but also a very rich understanding of emotional, psychological, spiritual healing. And so I'm very grateful that I had that right from the beginning of my Christian life then as a young adult.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And we definitely have overlaps in our stories of how we came to be where we are currently. And yeah, my dad was a big fan of brick walls and one another's heads and things like that. And so yes, what really convinced me was realizing that God was loving. So same, it was an emotional, what does love even mean? What does that actually look like? Is it good? Can I trust it? Is love safe? Because if that was love, that was unsafe. So yes,
Exactly.
absolutely working through those things. And additional to, yes, does this intellectually actually check out? Because as someone who appreciates higher education, that also did matter. So yeah.
And I appreciate what you're saying, because yes, I was very afraid of love. I was afraid of love because the people who said they loved me hurt me. And so it took years. I should say, I don't mean to sound like it all happened when I was at L'Abri, my conversion. No, it's been years and years of emotional and psychological healing. And I like the way you put it, because you're afraid of love. You're afraid to accept love because love has been, issued. It's love has hurt you. And so I like the way you put that. It's important to experience a whole different quality of love.
Thank you for your willingness to be vulnerable and share about this. It's so, I can imagine people who I know will be listening to this later. And I think that's going to really touch their hearts and it's going to really speak to them deeply. So thank you for your willingness to talk about things that are not super fun to talk about.
No, it feels very vulnerable putting in a book. I didn't come public with it until my father passed away. I didn't want to do that while he was still alive. So it still feels, like you say, a bit vulnerable, but actually putting in a book and knowing that people are reading my story. So yeah, thanks for understanding that part of it.